Nobody warned them that the most dangerous thing in the nursery wasn't in the crib. It was perched on the railing. Watching, everyone thought the bird had become a problem. They were completely wrong. Petra Calloway had put Nico in his crib at 7:43. She remembered the exact time because she had checked her phone while pulling the cotton sleep sack up over his legs. 8 months old, 22 pounds. A baby who had never once given her a reason to worry. She dimmed the light, left the door cracked exactly 2 inches, the same 2 inches every night, and walked back down the hallway to the kitchen. Sable was already where Sable always was. The cockatiel sat on the back of the wooden kitchen chair near the window, watching Petra with one side of his face, the way birds do, gray and white, with the yellow crest and the orange cheek patch that had made Petra choose him from the shelter 3 years before Nico was born. He had been with her through an apartment, a move, a wedding, a pregnancy. He knew the layout of every room. He knew her schedule before she did. He was, by every measure, a calm bird. That was the first thing that mattered. That was the thing nobody would remember until later. Petra set the baby monitor on the counter and started on the dishes. The video screen glowed, Nico on his back, one arm flung out, still. The room was 68 degrees. She had checked. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. She was rinsing the second bowl when Sable made a sound she hadn't heard before. Not his contact call, the soft chirping he used when he wanted attention. Not his alarm sound, the one he'd learned after the smoke detector went off twice in the old apartment. This was something else. A clipped, short whistle, high and fast, repeated in a pattern that didn't match anything in his usual vocabulary. She turned to look at him. He was facing the hallway. Not the window, not the counter where his food was. The hallway. His crest was raised, fully raised the way it got during thunderstorms, and his body was turned at an angle she had never seen him hold. Sable. She said it the way you say a name when you're not sure why you're saying it. He didn't look at her. He kept making the sound, facing the hall. She checked the monitor. Nico was still. She told herself the bird had heard something outside. A car. A neighbor. Cockatiels were sensitive. She knew that everyone who had ever owned one knew that. He was probably reacting to a sound that hadn't even registered to her. That was the logical explanation. That was the one that fit everything she already believed about him. She went back to the dishes. Sable flew off the chair. She heard his wings before she saw the direction, a sudden snap of feathers, and then he was gone from the kitchen, gone down the hall. She heard the soft sound of landing, then the whistle again, the same clipped, repeating pattern, but louder now, coming from Nico's room. She set down the bowl. She walked to the hallway and stopped in the doorway of the nursery. Sable was on the crib rail. He was 4 inches from Nico's face, looking down at him. And he was still making that sound, the one without a name in her memory, the one she had never cataloged in 3 years of learning his vocabulary. Her first thought was the one any parent would have. The bird was too close to the baby. The bird had flown into the baby's room and was standing over him in the dark. And it was wrong. It looked wrong. Every part of it looked wrong. And she crossed the room in 3 steps and reached for him. He sidestepped along the rail, away from her hands, kept his eyes on Nico. Sable, come. He didn't come. She reached again. He moved again. And then she did something she had not done in 3 years of owning him. She raised her voice at him, sharp and sudden, the way you do when you're frightened, but don't know what you're frightened of yet. He flinched, his crest flattened. But he did not leave the rail. She looked at Nico. He was still. He looked exactly the way he looked every night at this time. She picked Sable up firmly, walked him back to the kitchen, and put him on his perch tree, clipped the flight restriction tether she had stopped using 6 months ago because he never needed it. She went back to the nursery, pulled the door closed until it was a 2-inch gap, same as always, stood in the hallway for a moment listening. Nothing. Nico sleeping. Everything fine. She told her partner, Darian, when he got home 40 minutes later. She said it the way you say something you're slightly embarrassed about. The bird got into the baby's room and wouldn't leave. Darian said cockatiels were reactive. He said Sable had probably heard the mobile moving or seen something through the crack in the door. He had read about cockatiels. He knew how sensitive their nervous systems were. They both agreed it made sense. That was the second time they were completely wrong. At 11:17, Sable started screaming. Not the whistle, screaming the full contact alarm call that Petra had heard exactly twice in 3 years, both times when a strange cat had appeared on the windowsill, a sound built for emergency, a sound that cut through walls. She was out of bed before she was awake. She hit the hallway at a run, and by the time she reached the nursery door, she could already hear what was wrong with Nico, except she didn't know she was hearing it yet. It registered as quiet. It registered as not enough sound. A baby at 8 months, woken, should be crying. He was not crying. He was making a small, soft noise that she would describe to the paramedic later as wheezing, a thin, constrained sound, like breathing through something narrow. His lips, when she got to the crib and turned on the light, had a quality she couldn't name in the moment, a grayish tint around the edges that her brain registered as wrong before she could identify why. She picked him up. He was limp in a way that was not sleep limp. His chest was working too hard, small ribs visible with each breath, and the breaths were too fast and too shallow and not deep enough. She called emergency services. From the kitchen, Sable was still screaming. The paramedic who arrived was named Trenton Marsh, 14 years on the job. Pediatric calls were the ones he never talked about at home. He assessed Nico in under 90 seconds. Oxygen saturation, 81%. Normal for an infant of Nico's age was 95 to 100. He put the mask on and started the supplemental oxygen and did not say everything was fine, because it wasn't. And Trenton Marsh had been doing this long enough to know that the parents needed honesty more than reassurance. In the ambulance, Petra sat beside Nico and held his hand, his whole fist wrapped in both of hers, and at some point she said, almost to herself, the bird was in his room earlier. Trenton looked up. She told him what Sable had done. The first visit to the crib, the whistle she hadn't recognized, the flight back, the tethering. He asked her, what time was that? She said, around 8:30, 8:40 maybe. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, the bird went back 3 times? She said, yes. He said, when did you tether him? She said, around 9. He wrote something on his clipboard. Nico had developed viral bronchiolitis, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, that had been building since Tuesday when he'd had a mildly runny nose that Petra had attributed to the dry weather. RSV in infants under 12 months could progress rapidly and silently. The oxygen saturation could drop before there were visible symptoms a parent would recognize as emergency. No fever in the early hours, no dramatic crying. Just a gradual narrowing of the airways and a slow, quiet depletion of the oxygen in the blood. The pediatric pulmonologist, Dr. Amara Voss, explained this to Petra and Darian the next morning. She had 14 years in pediatric respiratory medicine. She had seen RSV present this way more times than she liked to count. She said, based on the timeline, his saturation had likely been dropping for 2 to 3 hours before you found him. She said, in infants this age, the compensatory mechanism can mask the severity. They work harder to breathe without showing the distress that would make a parent call for help. She paused. She said, the bird entered the room at approximately 8:30. You found your son at approximately 11:15. Whatever that bird was detecting, the change in breath chemistry, the increased respiratory effort, the scent change that comes with oxygen depletion, it was detecting it 2.5 hours before you could see it. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something true. She said, if you had not come when you did, we would be having a very different conversation right now. Petra sat in the family room on the second floor of the hospital for a long time after that. She thought about the moment she had crossed the room in 3 steps, the way she had reached for Sable, and he had moved along the rail, not fleeing, not panicking, just staying between her hands and the baby, staying at the crib. She thought about the tether. She had tethered him at 9, and then she had gone back to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and sat at the table and told Darian about it, and they had agreed it made sense. The sound through the crack in the door, the mobile, the sensitivity of cockatiels. They had agreed on the explanation that required the least amount of them. She had clipped his flight restriction and gone to bed. And for 2 hours and 15 minutes, Nico had been in his crib, his oxygen falling. and Sable had been in the kitchen on his perch, and there had been nothing. She thought about that for a long time. There is documented research, published in peer-reviewed journals conducted in university laboratory settings, on the ability of birds to detect physiological changes in humans through olfactory and auditory cues. Cockatiels possess a hearing range that extends into frequencies inaudible to humans. They can detect changes in respiratory rhythm, the rate, the depth, the sound of airflow through a narrowed passage. From across a room, some researchers in animal behavior have proposed that certain birds develop what functions as a monitoring relationship with the humans they live closest to, particularly infants, whose higher-pitched respiratory sounds fall within ranges birds track instinctively. The change in breath chemistry that accompanies oxygen desaturation, a shift in the ratio of exhaled gases, an alteration in the volatile compounds on the skin, is detectable to animals with refined olfactory sensitivity well before it is detectable to any human in the same room. Sable had not been trained. Nobody had taught him what a saturation of 81% smelled like. He already knew. They kept Nico for 3 days. Supplemental oxygen, monitoring, supportive care. His saturation climbed back to 97 by the second morning. By the third day, he was reaching for the nurse's stethoscope with both hands and laughing when she let him hold it. On the day they brought him home, Petra removed the tether from Sable's perch tree. She had not touched it since the night in the hospital hallway. She pulled it off the perch in one motion and put it in the drawer where the old instruction manuals lived, the drawer that never opened except by accident. Sable watched her do it, watched with one side of his face, crest neutral, the way he watched most things. She carried Nico into the kitchen in the sleep sack, the one with the small stars on it, and she set him in the bouncer seat on the counter so he could see the room. And Sable made a sound, the contact call, the soft one, the one she had known for 3 years. He made it twice, and then he moved to the end of his perch tree closest to Nico. And he sat there. He had known something was wrong before the machines did, before the monitor did, before she did. He had gone back 3 times. That night, at the time she always dimmed the nursery light and walked back down the hall, Petra paused in the doorway. Sable had followed her to the nursery. He stood now on the top rung of the small wooden chair she kept in the corner of the room, the one with the chipped paint on the left leg, the one that had been her grandmother's, and he was facing the crib. Nico was already asleep, one arm flung out, same as always. She watched Sable for a moment. His crest was soft. His breathing was slow. He wasn't watching the room the way he watched it during a thunderstorm. He was watching Nico the way he watched things he had already decided were his to watch. She left the door cracked, the same. 2 inches. She went back to the kitchen. If you stay for the stories of what our animals know before we do, you are in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the one that comes next. The sound Sable made that night at 8:30, the one without a name in Petra's memory, she described it to Dr. Voss during the follow-up appointment 6 weeks later. She tried to reproduce it, the clipped whistle in a repeating pattern. Dr. Voss listened. She said she had heard of cases like this. She said the research was underfunded and underreported, but it existed, and it was growing. She said, "The thing about animals is they don't need to understand what they're detecting. They just respond to it." She said, "He didn't know what RSV was. He didn't know what oxygen saturation meant. He just knew something about that baby had changed. And he went back. And then he went back again." She folded her hands on the desk. She said, "3 times, you said." Petra said, "He was right all 3 times." Has your animal ever done something that made no sense? Until the moment, it was the only thing that made sense? Tell us in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard. The first time Sable had stood on the crib rail, before Petra reached him, before she crossed the room, he had looked down at Nico for exactly the length of time it takes a bird to be certain. That long. Not afraid, not alarmed. Certain. The way animals are when they have already understood something that the room around them has not caught up to yet. Every guardian deserves to be recognized, even the ones who navigate by frequencies we cannot hear and never asked for any of the credit. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. 6 weeks after the hospital, Petra found Sable one morning sitting on the edge of the baby monitor on the nightstand. He had flown there quietly sometime in the night, and he was facing the nursery wall, just sitting. She didn't move him. She went to the nursery and checked Nico, who was fine. Asleep, saturation perfect, one arm flung out in the way he always slept. She came back to the bedroom. Sable was still on the monitor. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched him for a minute. He was just watching the wall, listening to something she couldn't hear. She let him. There are animals doing this right now, in houses and nurseries, in rooms where everyone else is asleep, detecting the things our instruments miss, making sounds we don't have the vocabulary for yet. We just don't know their names.